Olá, estamos aqui muito honrados com a presença de Hillel Neuer, diretor executivo da UN Watch, uma ONG que busca monitorar os passos da ONU, fazendo com que ela siga os termos de sua carta fundadora. E Hillel atua muito na questão de direitos humanos, de liberdade, fazer com que as pessoas sejam igualmente tratadas pela lei, e vai ser um prazer conversar sobre vários termos da geopolítica aqui com Hillel Neuer. Hi Hillel, nice meeting you. Thanks for being here with us. And just to start, what brings you to Brazil?
Well, I came actually for an organization that invited me, which has, by chance, the same name as I do. There's an organization called Hillel International, which is a terrific organization celebrating its 20th year in Rio de Janeiro. They work with Jewish students on university campuses. They bring them classes, teach them about Judaism, about leadership, community development, building the next generation of community leaders, people who are engaged with Jewish identity, Jewish culture, Jewish values, but also engaged in trying to make Brazil and this world a better place. Really a wonderful organization that I actually was involved in when I was in Canada with the Hillel movement that existed there. So they celebrated 20 years anniversary in Rio, and I was there for a very beautiful event there. And then here in Sao Paulo, they launched the organization here to help teach Jewish students and give them education and identity and culture here in Sao Paulo. And I really had a wonderful evening here as well. So terrific organization, and I'm glad that they brought me here.
What is UN Watch? What its goals? When was it founded? And how did you came to be together with them?
It's actually a product of liberal internationalism in its best sense. Some of the intellectuals who were surrounding Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and they speak about international peace, security, fundamental freedoms. So most people can agree on many of the principles in the United Nations Charter and also in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But of course, governments tend to become corrupt, and certainly at the world body, where, first of all, many of the governments there are not democracies, China, Russia, Venezuela, etc. That already makes it of a certain character. And then, of course, even the governments that are democracies, the UN is so far from the people that it's not really held accountable. So much happens in obscurity, very little transparency, very little accountability, if any. So a lot of things wrong are happening there that are in violation of what the UN was meant to be. So our organization was found to hold them accountable. And our founder was an interesting person. He's no longer alive. His name was Morris Abram. He was a civil rights leader. He was a lawyer from the South in America, from Georgia. And he was very active with Martin Luther King, fighting for equal rights for Black people in the United States in the 1950s and the 60s. And eventually Morris Abram, he was also a Jewish leader. He was head of the American Jewish Committee, the movement to free Soviet Jews. And eventually he was made United States ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva. And and after he retired from being US ambassador, he saw what was happening at the UN. He thought that the UN wasn't going away. We needed it, but it had to be held accountable. So he created UN Watch, and we've always been have a general focus on holding the UN accountable, helping human rights victims, fighting dictatorships, and also fighting anti-Semitism. And we are the leading group that is exposing the pathological anti-Israel bias that happens virtually every day at the United Nations.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. And let's explore the beginning of the UN. The UN was founded in 1945 by 50 countries, among which were authoritarian regimes such as Russia and China, USSR at the time. The main goal at the time was reaching and keeping peace. The world was in ruins after World War II, and right off the bat, you had these different countries with different sets of values. Not all of them cherished freedom, equality to the law, and human rights. So how do you see that that dichotomy right at the start of the UN?
Yes, you're quite right. You could say the UN, the creation of the UN, was somewhat of a balance between idealism and realism, pragmatism. The idealism is expressed in the United Nations Charter, which does speak about having a world in larger freedom and a world at peace and so forth. And the reality is that indeed, as you indicated, it was the victors of World War II, the alliance that had defeated Hitler, primarily in this case, the United States, Britain, Soviet Union, agreed to make this organization, which is kind of a second try because the first try was the League of Nations, created in Geneva, and we still use their building, which was inherited by the UN. That failed, and this was sort of round two. Winston Churchill said, better jaw than war. That was kind of the thinking. Yes, there was idealism. We had this horrible cataclysm of millions killed, and so there was an idealism that let's come together. But it was also pragmatism. You wanted to have those at the table who had a certain control. Right away at the Security Council, Stalin got the veto. So, critics will say, well, right from the start, it was undermined. And that's a fair criticism. The thinking was to have some kind of a balance between those who have the power and trying to see that another world war wouldn't happen again. So that was the thinking. Certainly the fault lines were visible early on. I mean, the Cold War began very quickly after the creation of the UN. And in many ways, the UN for 50 odd years was frozen. The many things could never get done at the UN because it was stalemated by the Cold War. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, suddenly the UN bit more active in certain things, but certainly you saw it. For example, the influence of the Soviet Union when they were drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There are all kinds of social rights in there, which a classic supporter of civil and political rights would find foreign, and would say these don't belong in a human rights declaration. So there was a strong push by the Soviets to put in their kind of socialist, if you want, Marxist, communist ideas and language. So there were battles when they were drafting the Universal Declaration and in the years afterwards. So it is something that was there from the beginning and needs to be acknowledged. And of course, over time, it got much worse. You had so many others joining who made the alliance of dictatorships, the anti-Western alliance, the anti-Israel alliance, more or less the same countries, made it even worse, you could say, than it was at the beginning. Yeah. Certainly the numbers changed. At the beginning, like you said, it was 50 odd countries. A good amount of them were democracies, not perfect, but they were democracies. And then, by the 60s, you have decolonization and you have, now you have 150 countries and many of them were not democracies. And many of them were influenced by the Soviet Union to turn against the West, America, Israel, sometimes as a proxy. So then you had a very different United Nations starting from the late 60s.
Yeah, and after World War II, the world went into a period of peace. There was the Cold War, but it was an era of deception and proxy wars. Do you think, and in Europe and the United States, there was a long period of peace until the early 21st century. Do you think the UN had an important role to play in this long period of peace in the developed countries?
You mean, let's say in Europe, for example? Yeah. I doubt it. I don't think the UN was very involved. The UN, at its best, it has its best, it has its worst. At its best, if there are two warring parties that want to reach an agreement, the UN is the technical team that can go back and forth and, a bit of a messenger service, and the peacekeepers aren't really keeping the peace, but, they can create some distance between two parties that themselves are not interested in war. If one or the other party is interested, the UN is not going to do anything. So the fact that there was a peace in Europe was probably because of missiles that Ronald Reagan sent and stuck them in Germany to push back the Soviets. It wasn't because of any UN action.
So, do you believe that the UN can actually make a difference into reaching peace now that we have a relatively tense period geopolitically? We have the Israel-Gaza war conflict. We have the Ukraine war. We have Donald Trump. We have China and Putin and growing tensions. Do you believe the UN, if restored, can make a difference in this scenario? And how would you think the UN's role would be to improve this situation?
The UN does not have a positive role to play, unfortunately, the way that the UN is today. The powers that be at the UN, on the various issues you mentioned, I can't think of anything positive that they have to contribute. Now, in an ideal world, if there were free democracies that would stand up at the UN, push back against the dictatorships, if we had less dictatorships and we had courageous democracies, we'd have a different UN. But the UN that we have today is very much an anti-Western alliance. Not always. At different times, you can have different coalitions can arise. There was a coalition that arose against Putin. It didn't always get a huge majority, but the pro-Russia groups were a bit quieter. So you had, for example, I'm going to speculate at the number, but you might have had 80 voting yes, maybe even a bit more, to condemn Putin for invading Ukraine, and maybe 25 defending him. So that's a nice majority. It's maybe 80 to 25, more or less. But that's 80 countries that are like abstaining. So there you have an example where the EU was very mobilized. So that's like 30 countries, and they pull in the South Koreas and the Japans and those who vote with them, the Canada and Australia and whatnot. And the other countries in the world were hesitant to support Putin. There are cases where, with vigorous leadership by Western democracies, on certain occasions, they can play a positive role. It is the exception. And many of the things you say, talk about Donald Trump. There is a natural anti-Western alliance in the UN, so they have a natural tendency to push back. Certainly, when America is in a conservative phase, and Donald Trump is unique and he's his own kind of animal. But even if it was George W. Bush or whoever it was, the UN is constantly seeking, many of the elements there are seeking to push against America and somehow to restrict or restrain America and see themselves as a counterforce. So on most of the issues that you described, there is not a majority there, with a few exceptions, to play a positive role at the UN. So if something positive happens, it's usually despite the UN and not because of the UN.
So would you summarize the role of UN Watch as a force to avoid the current state of the UN from making things worse rather than helping it make things better?
Yes, I think that's correct. Look, we are trying to make things better, and again, from time to time, you can find a majority on a certain issue. I'm trying to think of an example. North Korea doesn't have many allies, so you can pass a resolution on North Korea. You can pass a resolution sometimes on Iran, not the strongest resolution, but something from time to time. So yeah, we're constantly setting the bar on what the UN should be doing and calling them out when they do the horrible things, which are sort of every day, electing some of the worst dictatorships to high positions on human rights bodies, creating mechanisms that defend dictatorships. I'll give an example, which will sound ridiculous, but it's true. About 10 years ago, the United Nations Human Rights Council created a mandate, a position, with the title Special Rapporteur against unilateral coercive measures. Unilateral coercive measures. That is doublespeak, or I don't know what. It's a euphemism for sanctions. When America, Britain, Canada, the EU impose sanctions on Maduro, on Iran, on Sudan because they're murdering their own people, and it's a small measure to put pressure on those dictatorships. The dictatorships created this position to say the sanctions are illegal and against human rights. And it was created by Cuba with the help of Iran and others. And there's an expert, a woman from Belarus, very close to the Russian regime. Her name is Alina Duhan. She goes around the world. She shows up in Caracas. She meets with Maduro and says, you, Mr. Maduro, Mr. President, you are a victim of human rights violations because of Western sanctions. And all the problems of Venezuela are because of Western sanctions. And she's the UN, human rights. So he says, wonderful, you're great. And he takes her report and he went to New York, Maduro, and he said, the UN expert said. Then she went to Tehran. She put on the hijab. A press conference behind her is a picture of the Ayatollah Khamenei and the Ayatollah Khomeini. And she's saying, Iran, there's problems because of Western sanctions. She went to Syria under Assad. She went to China with the Uyghurs, 1 million Muslim Uyghurs thrown into camps. And she said, no, I went to that province, Xinjiang, and everything is fine. The same year that she got $200,000, her office received as a gift from China. She said it was to her office. No one is showing the accounts. We don't know what's happening with the money. So this is a recurring phenomenon at the UN, is that human rights mechanisms are twisted, are subverted, and are used to shield dictatorships. That's the kind of day-to-day battles that we're in, where it's hard to even speak about what you're speaking about, is getting the UN to do the right thing on things sometimes, but for us, often just trying to root out the infection is a lot of work.
And you have an ongoing campaign today to replace or fire Francesca Albanese, the special rapporteur for Palestine. Could you explain this campaign?
On April 4th, we expect that she will come up for reappointment. Who is Francesca Albanese? She is the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine. It means she's supposed to be an investigator to speak out on human rights in Palestine. In fact, she only condemns Israel. Actually, the details of the position, it says to investigate Israel's violations. So actually, the job the UN gave her is to investigate only Israel. And they picked her because she's the most vitriolic hater of Israel, and that's who they wanted. And they gave her a UN title, UN immunity. She goes around the world, and she says Hamas is legitimate resistance. She says openly anti-Semitic things that you would see from a neo-Nazi. She says America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby. America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby. That's straight out of a sort of white supremacist, neo-Nazi, Adolf Hitler vocabulary. And she's a UN expert. It's really shocking. When she was appointed on April 1st, 2022, we objected. We made the case, but they picked her because that's what they wanted. And over the past 3 years, she has repeatedly legitimized Hamas violence. On the day of the massacre on October 7th, when 1,200 Jews were killed in one day, she wrote, wait, you have to put their violence in context. To put it in context, there's a way to understand it. It's a response to Israel's aggression. This is the day of the massacre. And she's about to be reappointed, and we have a very fierce campaign that we fought. And so far, we couldn't get one member state. Our Human Rights Council has 47 members. We couldn't get one of them to officially object to her being reappointed. We did get, other than Israel, Argentina under Milei sent in a letter. Hungary sent in a letter. The US Congress sent in a letter. 42 French MPs and 10 members of the European Parliament. Here and there, different groups, different people, but couldn't get France, couldn't get Germany, even though both of them have condemned her for her anti-Semitism, which is very rare for a European country to condemn a UN expert for anything, let alone for racism or anti-Semitism. But she was condemned this past year by France twice, by Germany once, and yet they are not willing to object for various reasons that we can speculate. The Netherlands publicly said, we don't want her to be there. We oppose it, but they didn't send in the formal letter. So the president of the Human Rights Council, who's Swiss, it changes every year, he can say, we have our custom of automatic reappointment. We haven't received an official objection from any member of the council, therefore she's reappointed. And that's how it's looking at this stage, which is shocking because she is one of the most notorious anti-Semites on the world stage today.
Yeah, and I'd like to explore this anti-Semitism that has been growing in very dangerous levels. And I went through Francesca's social media. I picked dozens of criticisms towards Israel and its action on the conflict, but I couldn't find one criticism of the actions of Hamas, nothing. And when October 7th is mentioned, it's in a level of, let's say, it's so trivial that it's the approach to October 7th is there's no empathy for the level of violence and direct act towards civilian and complete disregard for any Geneva Convention. So why is that? Why is there this level of condoning with anti-Semitism and this ideology that is spreading all over Europe and the United States? And afterwards, I'd like to talk about the universities in the United States. But why is that there's all this level of rising anti-Semitism?
Well, you're quite right about her Twitter feed. It is full of basically Hamas propaganda. And if she talks about October 7th, as you said, it's not sincere, and the lack of empathy, as you said, is manifest and shocking. Where does this come from? And again, when you speak about this person, because she has said textbook statements that are literally the definition of anti-Semitism, saying the Jews control the country, saying, as she does, that Israel is like Adolf Hitler and Nazis. Sadly, I understand that in Brazil in February 2024, Lula, the president, went to Africa. I think it was in Ethiopia at an African summit, and he compared the actions of Israel to Adolf Hitler killing Jews in the Holocaust, which was disgusting. So sadly, there are certain individuals, including prominent individuals, who have brought us back, it seems, to where we didn't want to be. We grew up, it seems, in a golden age, and on the question of fighting anti-Semitism. Before the Holocaust, in polite society in Canada and Europe, you could say, I don't like Jews, and they're like this and they're like that, and I don't want them in my club. You could have a sign saying Jews can't come in our club. And after the Holocaust, 6 million Jews were slaughtered. People were ashamed. And that kind of anti-Semitism, it still existed, but it made a big retreat. There was a taboo against that kind of crass, open anti-Semitism. And anyone who grew up in the 70 years after World War II benefited from a rare time, certainly in Western society, and I presume here in Brazil as well, where Jews probably had the least amount of anti-Semitism maybe in 1,000 years. And it seems like the taboo that existed has been largely erased. Someone like Francesca Albanese, in my work, because I've been doing this for about 20 years, her predecessor, a few years back, one of her predecessors, a man named Richard Falk, he had the same position. He also said Hamas are very lovely people. Okay, and he promoted the 9/11 conspiracy theory that America itself attacked the World Trade Center to justify wars in Iraq. He supported some of the people making those ridiculous and obscene statements, and he said bad things about Jews, even though he was born Jewish himself. But he said a lot of horrible things about Jews, and a very nasty character, and certainly viciously anti-Israel, anti-American, and in his own strange way, somewhat anti-Semitic too. when we called him out, we got Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General at the time, to condemn him in print and in person at the Human Rights Council, which is very powerful. British Parliament, Canadian Parliament, US Congress, the group Human Rights Watch, which is far left, which is very anti-Israel, they were so embarrassed that they removed Richard Falk. He was on one of their committees in Santa Barbara, California. There was a committee, he was on it. They removed him from the committee. So it's not that long ago. We're talking maybe 10 years ago. Not even. He was elected, I think, in 2008. So yeah, so it's more actually. It's more. So, but it's a little more than 10 years ago. The same taboos that once existed are no longer there. Francesca Albanese, if she were saying the same things and was made a UN expert, she would not be welcome in Georgetown, Princeton, Harvard, leading universities in Europe. It was a different time. And so after October 7th, there's no question that the taboo of anti-Semitism has fallen, and we are facing a tsunami around the world. And it seems to me and many others that we've kind of gone back in history, whether it's the 30s, the 20s, but it's a time that is prior to the post-war taboo that I mentioned.
So just to make sure that I understood correctly, you said that before October 7th, 2023, this person with this level of anti-Semitism, she wouldn't be welcome in an American university like Princeton, Columbia.
Well, it's
and now she is?
Yes. Well, to sharpen the point, I would say it was a steady erosion. It wasn't black and white wasn't October 6th like this and October 7th like that. There was a steady erosion. And October 7th was next level, was on steroids. That's what I think happened. I mean, certainly those who hate the Jews, who used to say, we hate the Jews because they killed our Lord. Say, we hate the Jews because they're racially inferior. We hate the Jews because they're communists. Certain things after World War II didn't quite fit. And anti-Semitism, the only way to understand it is it's a virus that mutates. It mutates, and in order to be effective, it latches on to what is virtuous at that time and at that place. So if you're in Christian medieval Europe, people are officially Christian, you say the Jews killed Christ, therefore let's beat them and kill them and burn them. When you were in 19th century Europe, where society began to be non-religious, so in the name of Enlightenment values, the Jews are a clan. They're not really joining the people of France or something. They're apart. So we condemn them for being too communal. Then as nationalism began towards the end of the 19th century, say, wait, the Jews, they have no nation. They're rootless cosmopolitans. Now we hate them because they're too universalists. They're not nationalists enough. Then the Jews created Israel, and they had a nationalism, Zionism, and they said, oh, they're too nationalist. So those who hate the Jews are always finding some new reason, and certainly in the past, coming back to your question, in the past half century, if you want to mobilize hatred, you say what's virtuous today for most people is human rights and anti-racism. In most Western societies, these are some of the great banners: human rights and anti-racism. So Israel becomes the ultimate violator of human rights, war criminal, and this is very significant, they declared Israel an apartheid state. And so when I say October 7th, it's very important to understand that there was a steady deterioration, which was deliberate. Those who hated Israel were pushing, and they kept pushing, and they said, okay, next we're going to do the apartheid smear to accuse Israel of being the only country in the world that's an apartheid state. Amnesty International, 200 pages. Human Rights Watch, 300 pages. One after the other. Now, to do a 200-page report for a huge international organization, there's many stakeholders, people complain, takes a long time. The fact that they came out within months of each other, it was orchestrated. Yeah. And I don't normally talk about things that are orchestrated, but obviously, and Amnesty was in Israel. Agnes Kalamard, the director, and her Middle East guy, his name is Philip Luther. They went to Jerusalem about 4 or 5 years ago, 3 years ago, I don't remember exactly, to present their report on apartheid. And a journalist from the Times of Israel named Lazar Berman, he asked the two of them, I'm just curious, this is your first report accusing a country of apartheid. How did you come to that? And they say, we have to start somewhere. So yeah, I'm curious, he said, because in China, there's 1 million Muslim Uyghurs who've been put into camps. And did you think of looking at them, whether that's apartheid, whether that's racial crimes? And they said, maybe an interesting question, but no, we have to begin somewhere. So began with that. It was very telling. And you could see that it was very focused on their part to go with the apartheid thing. When the apartheid report started coming out, as a Jew who's in this industry, I began to shudder because I understood what they were doing. They were putting a red X on my forehead, and basically any other proud Jew who identifies with Israel, which is the nation state of the Jewish people. It's a part of the Jewish religion. Some far left Jews say, I'm Jewish, but I don't care about Israel. Then you don't know what Judaism is. Judaism is 3 times a day, Jews pray to return to Zion. The prayers, a third of the prayer book is about Zion and Israel. When a Jewish wedding happens, they put the ring on the bride's finger, they make blessings, they drink some wine, and then they sing, if I shall forget Jerusalem, let my tongue cleave to my palate. Let I suffer, should I ever forget Jerusalem? And then they break a glass, which is to remember the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. So every single ritual, when you're praying, when you're reading the Torah, Israel is central.
Before Islam even existed.
Yes,
right?
That's right. Right. Islam is the 7th century, and the King David ruled over ancient Israel 3,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So the point is that Amnesty International and the other groups who are demonizing Israel understand that that is a mechanism to demonize Jews. The same people who might have said, I hate Jews because of this, because of that, what's most effective today said, no, I'm not against a person, I'm against the country. But then we say the country's apartheid, evil. So I understood that when they used that word, that was a next level demonization. And then what do you say after that? Well, after that is genocide. But it has to have some, even a half-truth, a third truth, a 10th truth, needs to have something. So you need dead bodies. So they were waiting. Actually, Francesca Albanese wrote before October 7th that her next report may deal with genocide. And she thinks Israel's creation in 1948 is the beginning of a genocide. So the next level of demonization was on their radar. They were looking for it. And when October 7th happened, they said, okay, Hamas killed 1,200 people in a day. Israel's now bombing them. Hamas deliberately put all their terror tunnels underneath homes, hospitals, and schools. Israel's going to come after them fiercely, and Hamas deliberately wants civilians to die. Then you get 100 civilians, 1,000 civilians. Sometimes you have 1,000 people who were killed. Were they civilians, combatants? Hamas wouldn't tell you. But the point is, now you have a lot of bodies.
I think this is an important point. There's a Geneva Convention, and one of the main points is that it is established is that if you're a country in war, you should distinguish your soldiers from the civilians. And apparently Hamas doesn't do that, except for the videos when they want to send a message to the world, then they have soldiers dressed up.
Right. Yes, you're quite right. The essence of the Geneva Conventions is to distinguish between combatants, those who are the fighters, the soldiers, and civilians. And civilians are not to be targeted. Of course, civilians will always be harmed in a war, especially when the battle is close to the civilians. And that's what Hamas does. I mean, Hamas doesn't just violate the Geneva Conventions, they trample them, they destroy them, they have contempt for them. The whole essence of Hamas's modus operandi is deliberately to attack Israel and fire rockets next to civilian homes, to put their terrorist infrastructure underneath where the civilians are, in order to incur response fire from Israel to incur casualties, and then for the information warfare to use that to tarnish Israel. And the hatred against Israel has been generated by images, by numbers, even if the numbers might be somewhat fake. Obviously, a lot of civilians were killed. Hamas fakes a lot of the numbers, doesn't say that thousands of them are combatants. They'll say a 17-year-old, a child is killed. Yeah, the guy was carrying a Kalashnikov and was firing rockets at Israel. He wasn't really an innocent child. He was a combatant.
And
yeah.
Let me make another question regarding this point, because so Israel follows all the Geneva Conventions and was even beyond, like letting Gazans know where they're going to bomb.
Yes.
The other side doesn't follow basically
no, on
any.
October 7th, no one said, "Oh, we're going to attack. Can you leave? Go away."
Yeah.
No one said
and,
that.
And why there's this condoning at the UN and this over criticism of Israel, which follows the Geneva Conventions, which are part of, play a role in the UN, and no criticism towards the other side, which doesn't seem to follow any of the points in the Geneva Convention.
No, it's actually astonishing. You know, Israel has a challenge that few other countries have ever faced. America, France, and the Allies were fighting ISIS in Fallujah, and they were fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan. There were moments in Iraq where they did have to fight terrorists embedded in civilian areas, but no one has ever faced the kind of war, the assault on Israel, the invasion into Israel, into the homes, the massacre, the torture, and then the severity of the assault, and then having to fight an enemy that is entirely embedded among the civilians. And Israel has done better than any other country. And it's not me saying this. It's Colonel Richard Kemp, who was the former commander of British forces in Afghanistan. The most recent head of the British military wrote an article in the Times of London. He said, "I visited Israel. I saw how they conducted the war. No one could have conducted a war to prevent civilian casualties in the way that Israel has." Again, of course, there were many civilian casualties, but that was because Israel was aiming at Hamas and is obliged to destroy Hamas in order to defend its own people. And Hamas put itself. The numbers, the best expert guesses are something like 1 combatant killed to maybe 1.5 civilians. That's the best estimate. In wars in Iraq and elsewhere, it might have been like 1 to 6. For every combatant killed, maybe they killed 6, maybe they killed 7 civilians. So in fact, as you said, the United Nations should have said this is a horrible war. We want to commend Israel, which has lawyers. Every military unit has lawyers. They have a system of targeting. It's not perfect, but they are sincerely trying to target the terrorists and not the civilians. And yet the UN, instead of holding them out as an example, does the opposite.
How different do you think this conflict would be were Hamas following the Geneva Conventions?
It would be completely different. It would be completely, first of all, Hamas, it would be much easier to destroy them. You would see, I mean, when Israel fought Egypt in 1973, the Egyptians invaded the Sinai, and you saw them. They had uniforms, they had tanks. It was the middle of the desert, and you knew where the enemy was, more or less, and that's where the battle was. Had Hamas done the same, Israel would have had a much easier time fighting them, wouldn't have to kill any civilians, and but that would undermine Hamas's cynical and nihilistic strategy, which is deliberately to have those tens of thousands killed. We don't know the numbers. If it's 20,000, 30,000, we don't really know yet, but we'll assume it's in that range. That helped mobilize campuses around the world, from Columbia University to Geneva. And I think here in Latin America, you've had some of the anti-Israel protests, maybe not the same level. And to feed the mob, to feed the rage, you need to give them blood. So Hamas wouldn't have had that blood. So it would have been a much better world for everyone had that happened, but that's the opposite of what Hamas wanted.
So they don't follow the Geneva Conventions because it would make them less effective in achieving their goals.
Yes.
And but still begs the question: why is it that the UN so condescending with them not following the Geneva Conventions and criticizing Israel as if they were? Right.
Why are things upside down at the UN?
Yeah. I want to switch to the United States and these protests that were taking place in the universities. And right now you have Donald Trump, and you have the ICE has begun to revoke the visas of foreign students who are taking action in these protests. What's your take on that?
Well, each case has to be examined, and individuals who are detained deserve due process. And I trust that the U.S. courts, I'm a lawyer in New York, and I trust that the U.S. courts will follow the letter of the law and ensure that the government does so. But one has to understand what was going on in the past couple of years. It was a reality that no one should accept. The campuses, not just in the United States, but in Canada, where I grew up, have been taken over by mobs of openly pro-Hamas supporters of terrorism, dressed in keffiyehs, telling students, are you Zionist? If you're Zionist, which every Jew who's proud has a minimum. It's like, are you pro-Brazil? There'll be a handful of people who say, no, I hate Brazil because, I don't know, I hate Bolsonaro or I hate this. But the average normal person is proud to be Canadian, proud to be Brazilian. The average Jew is proud to be Zionist, because it just means you believe Jews should have the right to their homeland. So they were saying basically Jews can't come here. Various places on campus, if they would take it over and they would say no Zionists can come here. So really imposing apartheid.
In Montreal.
In Montreal and McGill University, at Columbia University, in many campuses, they were doing these kinds of things. And they were openly supporting Hamas as they're massacring families, children, raping. And you have these, not for a day, not for a week, but for a year and a half, taking over large parts of the campus. It's unbelievable. And the notion that we should accept the United States, while American hostages are still there, where Hirsch Goldberg, Poland, an American, was being tortured in the dungeons of Gaza, and that someone on a tour, on a visa, who's not even a citizen, should be invited to come to Columbia and to be a leader of these pro-Hamas protests, is just absurd. No normal country should allow that. Our authorities in the United States and in Canada tolerated it for far too long. Even though they were
they say these actions revoking their visas is against free speech.
Well, there are conditions when you apply for a visa. For example, these people are not citizens. I have friends and family members who have applied for a visa in the United States, and there are conditions, and you're aware of them. People are aware of them. And when you sign up for a green card, you promise to tell the truth in different things. Had he written, I'm going to come, this guy Mahmoud Khalil, I think is his name, who's Syrian of Palestinian origin. If he had written, I'm coming to the United States and I'm going to be leading protests against the evil American empire on one of the largest universities in America, would I get the visa? He would get the visa in a minute. I hope not, as Secretary Rubio said. So these people were not telling the truth on their visa. The visa can be revoked. And if the authorities can do something that is legal to send a message that radical terrorism supporters of rape and torture and slaughtering Jews are absolutely not welcome, that message needs to be sent. And for a year and a half, it was not sent. Not by the mayor of Montreal, not by the mayor of Toronto, not by many of the police forces in the United States, not by the universities, not Columbia, not Harvard, not McGill in Montreal. They were coddling the terrorism supporters. And it was shocking. And I think some adult has to say, no, this is not welcome. And again, America has very broad freedom of speech requirements. But if there are cases, because these people are foreigners, if you have strong evidence and if you can do it legally, I would kick them out. We don't need terrorism supporters in our country, and we have every right to remove a terrorism supporter, at our discretion. Again, do it with due process of law. Make sure you have the right guy, the right woman. But if they're supporting terrorism, you're not a citizen. I don't need you in my country. Go do it in Syria.
When you're applying for a visa, you are asked a question like, are you affiliated with a terrorist organization? And this affiliation is may be taken as a broad context or definition. Like a person can say he is not formally affiliated to a terrorist organization, and that he's exerting his freedom of speech. He's just speaking his mind, and he's not formally affiliated with a terrorist organization when he's there in the protests. What's your legal take on this and on this nuance?
Yeah, well, I'm not familiar with the particular provision that we're talking about. Normally, if you say affiliated with a terrorist group, my understanding is they're talking about some kind of a more concrete nexus beyond just saying positions that are similar. They're saying that you actually belonged to a group that either was Hamas or the Jihad, or a group that is a splinter group that's affiliated with it. That's just based on the scenario that you gave. I don't think that speaking itself makes you affiliated with a group. But again, if you're a non-citizen and you're in my country as a guest and you are speaking out against the enemy who is torturing Americans and supporting the most evil things, and we can revoke your invitation, I would do it.
Yeah. And it begs the question, why are these individuals in a country they despise?
Of course. Right. And, just to come back, those who are defending them, if it were a different scenario, if it was some kind of white supremacist came from Europe and started spouting horrible things about blacks and gays and women and what have you, not a single one of these people who are speaking out today would speak out. They would say, get this hater out of here. And we see it on campus. Those claiming freedom of speech, the Ivy League universities were the worst places in the world for freedom of speech. This place is this thing called microaggression. If you wouldn't use the right pronoun, if you said he for someone who you thought was a male, but it turns out they call themselves they, you could be, condemned for all kinds of things. And the big universities like Harvard were punishing faculty who somehow in a speech, in a lecture, used a wrong word that wasn't woke and politically correct. They had, zero respect for freedom of speech. And suddenly these people, they start shouting freedom of speech when it's to defend supporters of Hamas terrorism. Again, it's true the United States has the First Amendment. It's one of the most expansive constitutional provisions in the world for freedom of speech, but there are limits, and supporting Hamas terrorism when you're a non-citizen on a visa, lied on the visa, if you can kick that person out and send a message to all the terrorism supporters who are bullying, intimidating, harassing Jews. Jews in New York City, in one of the campuses, had to flee for their safety to a library, and then there were like mobs banging on the glass doors, like searching for blood. And this has been going on for a year and a half. And if the administration is saying, you know what, we're going to defend Jewish people, I think that's welcome.
Yeah, you spoke about woke ideology, and there was a rise in woke ideology for the past decades, and there were some incidents like Evergreen College in the United States where Professor Brett Weinstein was ostracized because
he came to school when you weren't supposed to come to school?
Yeah, because there was a day for only blacks to be in the university, and
it's called racism.
Yeah. Now, people who support this ideology, they say there's no racism from blacks against whites because blacks...
Power differential and all that.
Exactly. And do you think Donald Trump will put an end in this ideology, the woke ideology?
I think a lot of people did vote for him because of that. The idea that you had biological men with male genitalia showing up in women's locker rooms is outrageous and a serious threat to women. It's happening in prisons in the UK, in other countries, where someone said, I identify as a female, and the person still was a biological male. And the judge said, okay, you get to go to a women's prison. And then they attacked women, whether it was a female guard or female prisoners. And people who claimed to be woke were actually really putting women at risk. So I think that a lot of the voters for Donald Trump were thinking of things like that, and where the woke ideology became absurd, and it was sort of a madness. A madness took over America. Now, Donald Trump has his own temptations for extremes, and saying I'm invading Canada, I'm going to take over Canada, I'm going to take over Greenland. These are just some examples. There's a lot happening, and I think one should be concerned that the pendulum could swing the other way. He sometimes speaks in a way that suggests there is no rule of law and he could do whatever he wants to. He can run for a third term. That's not helpful. And we don't want to replace woke left with woke right. And I think many Americans wanted normalcy. That's what I think why people chose Biden, is we were told he was the candidate of normalcy. But in fact, when he was there, a lot of the radical left ideology was being still pushed in various ways. So I think normalcy would be good. Donald Trump is, of course, unpredictable, and he's not going to give us quiet stability. But some of the excesses that could come from the MAGA movement should be kept in check. There's dangers there too.
Yeah. Now switching to the Ukraine war, you've expressed concerns about Donald Trump's position towards or a relationship towards Putin. He's mediating how would you rate his mediation of the conflict so far?
My default is that I'm very upset at the language that has come out of the Trump administration about Putin. Part of my work is defending victims of Vladimir Putin, people who've been in prison from his repression, and to see President Trump or his envoy Steve Witkoff or others saying positive things about Russia is offensive to me.
Yeah.
Now they say, and some defenders say, yes, well, he's mediating, and when you mediate, you need to say nice things about each side. Well, maybe, but there's a limit to what you need to say, and it seems that he's gone past that limit.
And what do you think is the path going forward? We had that incident with Zelensky at the White House.
Yes.
And now they're back in negotiations. What do you think is the path going forward?
It remains to be seen. Certainly, Europe and other Western countries are supporting Zelensky strongly, but America is irreplaceable. So without American support, it's going to be hard for Ukraine to stand strong, continue the war. The war is horrific. You have thousands dying on each side. And I think everyone decent does want the war to come to an end. That's what Trump says. And his administration, his defenders say they want the war to end. If that's true, that's noble. But we should not rush to give up our ability to speak the truth and to say that what Vladimir Putin did was naked aggression in 2022, that he is responsible for this war. And I hope that America will not abandon the people of Ukraine.
But I think there's a similar parallel with the beginning of the UN, because you have Putin was the first aggressor, and he's taken up territories in Ukraine, but it doesn't seem reasonable to think that he would be willing to go back to where they were 3 years ago before this conflict, much less to 2014 before he invaded Crimea.
And what's the parallel you see with the UN?
Because you're going to have to make some compromise dealing with people who cross red lines, start aggressions, and you gotta make peace.
You mean I said about the pragmatism that the UN involved America and others saying, okay, Stalin gets a seat at the table, he gets a veto, and we do business with him because we don't have a choice. We have to be pragmatic.
Yeah.
So you're saying so too today. Vladimir Putin is there. He's in Ukraine. He's not giving it up easily. Strike the best peace you can, right? That's the argument.
So you think it's reasonable to expect that some of the territory is not going to be given back to Ukraine?
Yeah, look, I don't want to speculate. Under international law, of course, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukrainian sovereign territory. Ukrainians had nuclear weapons that they inherited from the Soviet Union. They were told, give them up, and then you will be protected by the West, and that did not happen. So Ukraine's case is strong, and I wouldn't want to announce any kind of non-support for their sovereignty. What will happen in the end, assuming that both sides are willing to negotiate, it will be a negotiation, and each side will push to get the best that they can. And is it realistic today that Vladimir Putin will give up territory that he controls? No, he's going to fight till the end not to give it up. And it'll be up to the Ukrainians to decide what price they're willing to pay to get an agreement. And again, the big question is the agreement worth anything? How is it going to be verified? If Putin signs something and then he invades again 6 months later, a year later, what happens? What are the mechanisms? Remains to be seen.
Do you think that incident in the Oval Office had a silver lining to it, because European nations started raising budget for military? They've also realized the importance of not being overly dependent of Russia's energy. Do you think that incident that I don't believe, I don't remember anything like that like two heads of state having an argument in front of global media about a conflict with the adversary, the opponent, watching that on cable TV. But do you think there was a silver lining to it?
Potentially. I mean, the fact about the gas, the Europe woke up about the gas when Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022. So on that, they sort of woke up already. But certainly what you said about the military developing their own industry and so forth, that may indeed be a silver lining. And I would agree with you. I hope that the EU countries, European countries, do put more money into defense. Donald Trump is right in that they were happy to have America, rely on America for their defense and use their money for social welfare.
And also the energy, right? Russia is supplying energy to many European countries, and it's been clear in this point that Donald Trump had fair criticisms, right?
Yeah, he called them out on it back in his first term. Called them out on it. Yeah, on that he was. And look, my fear is, so I agree with you. I think it could be a silver lining that West European countries will wake up and invest more in defense, and that's an important thing. And my concern is that there may not be a concept called the free world anymore. And that's something that was a very big part of an important part of how we saw ourselves, which I think was real, that there was this notion of a free world. And Donald Trump's his distaste for any alliances, it concerns me. It concerns me. You want to negotiate with Canada, fine, but Canada is a very important alliance for America. As a Canadian, certainly we cherish the alliance with America, and Canada fought in all the world wars and lost a lot of people. And that was fighting against the Germans, the Nazis, Afghanistan, the Taliban. These are meaningful alliances, and when something happens, God forbid if America ever gets attacked like they did on 9/11, or someone else, you do want those alliances. So I hope that we won't see the end of the alliance of the free world.
And do you think a potential alliance between Russia and China play a big role in the demise of the free world, as you say?
Yes, and some argue that maybe Trump is cleverly trying to pull in Russia away from China, away from Iran, and that there's a whole strategy behind it. We'll have to see.
Yeah. Another campaign that is going on in UN Watch is to replace UNRWA. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes. It's a long topic.
Explain to our public what is UNRWA and what its original goals and what happened to it that you now have a campaign going.
UNRWA is the UN Agency for Palestinians. It was created around 1949, meant to be an agency that would help give Palestinians food, medical treatment, housing, who were displaced during the War of 1948, Israel's independence war, when 5 Arab states invaded Israel, declaring that they would do a jihad and push the Jews into the sea. The Arabs of Palestine were joined them in this battle, and cooperated with the various invading armies, and they lost the war. They managed to kill 6,000 Israelis, which was 1% of the population. It's a very significant percentage. And the Arabs who were displaced in nearby areas as a result of the war, UNRWA was created, the UN Relief and Works Agency, to help them redevelop and resettle. It had a noble goal. But several years into its operation, the Arabs said, we don't want to accept the war is over. If I say I accept that I'm now resettled in Lebanon or in Jordan, I'm giving up the war against the Jewish state, and this I don't want to do. And so UNRWA, at that point, starting in the 1950s, became pathological. A UN agency that was supposed to help Palestinians after 70 years hasn't resettled one. The opposite. They tell Palestinians, even if they've become citizens, in Jordan, 2 million Palestinians are Jordanian citizens for 70 years. They tell them, you're still a refugee. What does that mean? I mean, my family escaped Russia 120 years ago, 1904, came to Canada. They were refugees from Russia. We've been Canadian in my family for 120 years. I'm not a Russian refugee. It's over. We're Canadians. Only at the UN with UNRWA do 2 million Jordanians with Jordanian passports and citizenship have the status of a refugee. UNRWA tells them, you're going to go home to Israel. You're going to right of return, which is the nice euphemism. It's a way of saying you have the right to dismantle Israel. And so the Arabs who invaded from Gaza, the Hamas terrorists, the civilians who came with them, were educated in UNRWA schools where they were taught, you have the right to enter Israel, to dismantle Israel, the right of return. And that your home isn't here in Gaza. Even if Gaza is beautiful, even if Gaza has white sands and much of it is all on the beach, and even if you've been living here for 70 years, your home is there, Tel Aviv, Haifa. That's the pathology of UNRWA.
And what do you want to replace it with?
Palestinian autonomy, in the sense that Palestinians are not in perpetual need of a UN handout. There is this thing in the world where somehow there's almost a desire to always have a poor Palestinian who's sitting there and saying, give us money, I'm the poor Palestinian. It's very useful to have that image, the poor Palestinian, because it means someone is oppressing him, and that's Israel. So it seems that there are some in the West who want the image and the phenomenon of a Palestinian refugee, a suffering Palestinian. They want the suffering Palestinian. But what if Palestinians in Gaza had no replacement to UNRWA? UNRWA left, and what would they do? Govern themselves. But how can Palestinians do anything? Well, we saw for the past 10, 20 years, they built hundreds of kilometers of terror tunnels, very sophisticated terror tunnels. They built a war strategy. They surprised the IDF, the great army in the region, surprised them, invaded Israel, managed to massacre a lot of people, take hostages. They did a lot. So they're actually very capable people, and they have agency. And if they want to have schools, and if they want to collect taxes and give out bags of flour, they can do so themselves. But the UN and the international community seems to want to have them in a state of dependency, seems to want to have them as refugees, kind of a weapon against Israel, because they're going to undermine Israel. They're going to go from Gaza into Israel. So what replaces UNRWA? Ideally, it should be Palestinians ruling themselves. In the short term, there's a war going on. You may need UNICEF. You may need the World Food Program, UNDP. There are any number of programs all over the world that help refugees, people who need food. They can easily go into tiny Gaza for 2 million people and help them. So short term, bring in other agencies. Long term, get rid of this dependency, which only perpetuates war and aggression.
Yeah. Well, Hillel, before we end, you travel a lot. You're at UN Watch. I'd like to have your take on Brazil. How do you, and in Canada, Switzerland, where you live, Israel, what is the world's view on Brazil political scenario today?
It's a good question. I don't think it comes up that much, to be honest. It hasn't been on the world's radar the way that Turkey is now coming on the radar because Erdogan is arresting his opponents and everything. But certainly Lula, for those who care about democracy, rule of law, anti-Semitism, are concerned about Lula, certain tendencies. His statement that he made that's comparing Israel to Nazis was a horrific statement. People saw that. I think the fear that Brazil might have a kind of sympathy for some of the dictatorships like Maduro. Yes, he kind of criticized them, but not very much. I think that bothers some people. And otherwise, I don't think that Brazil has is not preoccupying the world news, but it's obviously a very important country. And I wish that their votes at the United Nations would change. Under Bolsonaro, their votes were better on a range of issues, including on resolutions attacking Israel. Lula, his government just voted yes for a sort of pro-Hamas resolution adopted by a large majority. And that's unfortunate. I hope that changes.
And as a lawyer, how do you see this move that has been taking place in France, in the US? Donald Trump has been denouncing it, of the judicial system moving into politics. How do you see that? Well,
do you mean sort of the weaponization of courts to target political leaders, whether it's Trump or maybe the other side, that sort of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's unfortunate that America is now at that stage. There are other countries. Maybe you had it here in Brazil where it's common that the person who was president, they go after him, they convict him, maybe he gets some prison, he can't run again, right? You had a bit of that here back and forth. In many countries, we didn't have it. I don't think you ever had it in the UK.
Romania as well.
Where they do have it.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm talking about the more major established democracies. We did not have it. Canada, we did not have this. United States, you did not have it. You had people hated George W. Bush, but no one was trying to put him in prison after he was, as far as I know, no significant attempt. But with Trump, there were many attempts. I don't know, dozens or whatever it was, but there was a sense by, I think, some reasonable people, not just the Trump supporters, that some of the judicial system, sometimes you have political prosecutors who are appointed by the Democratic Party, were going after Trump, maybe with some political motivations. That's unfortunate. And Trump is kind of open that he wants to get revenge in different ways. And that's not good for the system if you have that pendulum where there's a sense that it's all politics and not law. We'd like to have an independent judiciary. It's a very important institution for every society that is credible, seen as impartial. So I hope that the large Western democracies don't fall into that trap. Again, no one's immune. And if there's a president who did horrible things of a certain level, I think they should be held to account. But finding things about he gave money to a woman he had an affair with, and that was a campaign, sort of things that were never used before and are not really major crimes in the law of America, to suddenly go after a president for that seemed to many to be politically motivated, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, Hillel, it was a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
We hope to have you here again soon. Again, we invite you to watch our documentary about the Israel-Gaza war, From the River to the Sea. And maybe if you do, we can have another conversation like this one. I'd like to hear your takes on our documentary.
Great. I would look forward to seeing it. And thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.